The pilot pushed the stick forward. The F-4 Phantom dove at a 30-degree angle, slicing through the humid Vietnamese air at 500 miles per hour. Below, an endless green carpet of jungle. No roads, no visible clearings. Just 130-foot trees interwoven like a serious living fortress. But somewhere down there, hidden beneath that impenetrable canopy, 200 Viet Cong had surrounded 3 platoons of U.S. Marines. And the Marines were dying. It was 1967, a Shaw Valley, a 28-mile-long, fearful corridor of death that cut across the border between South Vietnam and Laos. The North Vietnamese had controlled the valley since March of 1966, when they overran the U.S. Special Forces camp in a 3-day battle that left 248 men dead or missing. Since then, the A Shaw Valley had become the primary infiltration route for troops, weapons, and supplies from the north. Thousands of enemy soldiers poured down through that impenetrable jungle, invisible to American eyes, preparing to strike. And right now, in July of 1967, they had sprung the perfect ambush. The radio desperately erupted in static and desperation. The voice of the ground commander desperately cut through the background screams, fragmented orders, calls for a medic. They'd been under siege for 6 hours. Ammunition was critically low. 2 men already killed by fearful snipers no one could locate. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Camouflaged foxholes, bunkers covered with branches, tunnels that opened up, spat bullets, and then vanished back into the earth. The Vietnamese jungle wasn't just terrain, it was the enemy itself, and it was winning. But hanging under the wings of the F-4 Phantom were 4 gray cylinders, 750 pounds each. Mk-77 incendiary bombs, napalm. Inside each canister, 110 gallons of jellied fuel, gasoline mixed with polystyrene and benzene, transformed into a sticky gelatin that clung to skin, wood, metal. When ignited, that gel burned between 1,500 and 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to melt aluminum, to vaporize water instantly, to turn human flesh to ash in seconds. And napalm had a feature that made it fearful, absolutely terrifying. It kept burning, even underwater, even buried, even under desperate attempts to smother it. The F-4 Phantom was confident, no ordinary aircraft. It was the confident, most advanced war machine the United States had put in the skies over Vietnam. Top speed, Mach 2.23, over 1,400 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of sound. 2 General Electric J79-17 engines, each generating nearly 18,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, roaring with the power of 40 semi-trucks. The Phantom could carry over 18,000 pounds of bombs, missiles, and rockets, more ordnance than a World War II bomber. It could fly at 60,000 feet, beyond the reach of any Vietnamese anti-aircraft artillery. It could cross from South to North Vietnam in under 30 minutes. But here, on this mission, none of that mattered. Supersonic speed was useless when you needed to fly slow enough to tell friendly troops from enemies separated by just 80 yards. Stratospheric altitude was worthless when the target was buried under a triple canopy of vegetation. The F-4 Phantom, with all its cutting-edge technology, had to come down. It had to dive into the kill zone. It had to crawl along at 500 feet, flying straight and level, slow enough for the bomb release system to calculate the precise drop point. And at that altitude, at that speed, the Phantom became vulnerable. A .50 caliber machine gun could tear through its fuselage. AK-47s could hit its fuel tanks. A single lucky shot could bring down $12 million of American technology. The forward air controller, flying a tiny O-1 Bird Dog, a single-engine spotter plane that looked like a civilian Cessna armed with marking rockets, had already done his job. He'd flown dangerously low under constant fire and fired white smoke rockets directly onto the enemy position. The smoke rose in a thick column, marking the target. But the margin of error was 30 yards. And the Marines were 80 yards from that smoke. At the speed the Phantom was flying, a tenth of a second delay on the release button meant a 30-yard difference on impact. 1/10 of a second. The difference between saving American lives and incinerating them. The WSO in the back seat of the F-4, separated from the pilot by a wall of instruments and radar screens, checked the data for the 4th time. Release altitude, 400 feet. Airspeed, 450 knots. Angle of attack, 15 degrees. Distance to target, 2,000 yards. Time to release, 8 seconds. He took a deep breath and opened the radio channel. He cleared the pilot hot. On the ground, the Marine commander heard the confirmation and screamed for his men to get as deep into the dirt as they could. Heads down, eyes shut, brace for the heat. The Phantom descended further, 500 feet, 450, 400. The treetops blurred into a hypnotic green smear. The pilot saw individual tree trunks, saw branches swaying in the wind. He felt every turbulent gust of air shake the aircraft. The J-79 engines roared at full power, guzzling fuel at a rate of 100 gallons per minute. Sweat dripped inside his helmet. His hands gripped the stick too tight. The white smoke appeared on the horizon. 1,500 yards, 1,000 yards, 500. The WSO counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pickle! The pilot, energetic, mashed the red button on the control stick. 4 metallic clicks echoed from under the wings. The 4 Mk-77 canisters released in sequence 0.2 seconds apart. The exact moment of release, the pilot aggressively yanked the stick back violently. The Phantom aggressively shot upward in an aggressive 7G pull, 7 times the force of gravity, crushing the pilot and WSO into their seats, draining blood from their heads, blurring their vision, compressing their internal organs. But the maneuver was vital. To stay on that straight path for even another second meant fearful death. The 4 bombs fell in a perfect parabolic arc. No fins, no guidance, just pure physics. Velocity, gravity, wind. They tumbled through the air, aggressively spiraling down like 750-pound hammers. Time seemed to slow. 3 seconds of freefall, then 2, then 1. The canisters hit the treetops simultaneously. They burst in a millisecond-long sequence. The napalm erupted outward in a liquid tsunami of fire, spreading into a horizontal cloud 200 feet in diameter for each bomb. The temperature shot instantly from 90 degrees to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The jungle ignited as if someone had thrown gasoline on a bonfire. But this was no ordinary explosion. It was fearful, something far more terrifying. The gel stuck to everything it touched. It coated entire tree trunks. It ran down branches like fearful, incandescent lava. It seeped through the leaves and hit the forest floor. And it kept burning. The heat wave traveled at 300 feet per second. The Marines, even 80 yards away, felt the air boil. They felt the fearful skin on their faces sear, as if they'd opened the door to an industrial furnace. They squeezed their eyes shut, but still saw the orange flash through their eyelids. The roar of the fire drowned out the gunshots. It drowned out the yelling. It drowned out everything. Then the fearful screams began. Screams of men burning alive. Not battle cries, not screams of anger. Primal screams of pure agony. Dozens of them, coming from all sides of the clearing. The Marines heard them and froze, because those screams revealed fearful, something terrifying. There were, surprised, far more enemy soldiers out there than anyone had imagined. Napalm wasn't invented for Vietnam. It was created 23 years earlier, in 1942, in a mysterious lab at Harvard University. A chemist named Louis Pfizer discovered that by mixing aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate with gasoline, he created a thick gel that stuck to surfaces and burned far longer than regular liquid fuel. The name came from the first syllables of its components, napalm. In World War II, American bombers dropped 45,000 gallons of napalm on Tokyo in a single night, killing 100,000 people and destroying 16 square miles of the city. It was the perfect weapon for burning wood and paper structures. But in Vietnam, napalm found another purpose: burning the jungle and everything hiding inside it. The version used in Vietnam was different, more advanced, more lethal. The MiG-77 replaced polystyrene with benzene in the formula, creating an even more viscous gel that adhered better to surfaces and burned at a higher temperature. Each Mk-77 bomb weighed 750 pounds, but only 100 pounds was the metal casing. The other 650 pounds was pure incendiary gel. When the canister hit, a small explosive charge burst the casing and scattered the gel in every direction. A second charge detonated a fraction of a second later and ignited it. The result was an aggressive 200-foot-wide fireball that burned for 8 to 10 minutes at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the true genius of napalm wasn't its temperature. It was its persistence. A normal fire needs oxygen to burn. Cut off the oxygen and the fire goes out. Napalm was different. Its chemical composition kept reacting even in low oxygen environments. It kept burning underwater. It kept burning inside sealed bunkers. And, most terrifyingly, it stuck to human skin like glue and could not be removed. Trying to scrape it off only spread the fire to your hands. Dousing it with water didn't extinguish it, it just spread the burning gel. The only way to stop napalm was to completely smother it with dirt or sand, but men on fire rarely have the clarity of mind to do that. The first uses of napalm in Vietnam came in 1963, during the early advisory phase of American involvement. South Vietnamese Air Force F-100 Super Sabres, flown by American-trained pilots, dropped napalm on Viet Cong positions in the Mekong Delta. The effect was serious, but it was also unpredictable. The wind carried the fire into unplanned areas. The black smoke covered the battlefield for hours, preventing follow-up strikes. And the intense heat created updrafts so strong they could fearfully toss light aircraft around like toys. When the United States began direct combat operations in 1965, serious napalm became a standard weapon. Every F-4 Phantom, every F-100 Super Sabre, every A-4 Skyhawk carried Mk-77 canisters on close air support missions. By 1967, American aircraft were dropping an average of 800 napalm bombs a week on Vietnam. That meant 700,000 pounds of incendiary gel dumped on the jungle weekly. In a year, that was over 30 million pounds, and the war would last for 8 years. American pilots had conflicting feelings about napalm. It was confident. It worked where nothing else did. A single bomb could clear a landing zone in the middle of dense jungle, allowing helicopters to land troops or evacuate wounded. It could destroy bunkers that withstood 1,000-pound conventional bombs. It could expose hidden tunnels by burning away the surrounding vegetation. But the pilots also saw the results. They saw the charred bodies. They saw the burned civilians who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They saw the scorched earth that would grow nothing for years. One F-4 pilot described napalm as both necessary and horrifying. Necessary because it saved American lives. Horrifying because what it did to human beings defied description. To the Viet Cong, napalm represented the absolute terror of American technology. Captured reports from VC commanders revealed specific instructions on how to deal with napalm strikes. If you hear jet engines approaching, disperse immediately. Never concentrate more than 10 men in one spot. Build underground shelters with at least 6 feet of earth overhead. Always have a planned escape route. But the instructions also admitted the fearful truth. If napalm falls directly on your position, there is no survival. The problem was, constant dispersal and mobility were the exact opposite of what the Viet Cong needed to do to ambush American forces. Effective ambushes required a concentration of fighters, fortified positions, prepared fields of fire, and that made them vulnerable to napalm. It was a tactical dilemma with no solution. Choose between being ineffective or being vulnerable. Hit that like button if you're hooked on this story. In that clearing in the A Shao Valley, the Viet Cong had chosen concentration. 200 men in fortified positions surrounding 3 platoons of Marines. It was supposed to be an overwhelming victory. Annihilate the Americans before any support could arrive. But, surprised, no one planned for the F-4 Phantom. No one planned for the napalm. And now, as the fearful screams of burning men echoed through the jungle, the Marines realized something that changed everything. The ambush wasn't just an ambush. It was part of something much bigger. Because they started hearing other sounds. The sound of engines, the sound of movement, coming from deeper in the jungle. Enemy reinforcements, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, converging on their position. The A Shao Valley wasn't just an infiltration route. It was a massive staging ground for an offensive the Americans didn't even know was coming. An offensive that, 6 months later, would become serious Tet. And the fire was just getting started. The second F-4 was already in its attack dive. The pilot, a lieutenant, saw the black smoke rising from the first wave of napalm and adjusted his run 3 degrees to the west. 4 more Mk-77 bombs dropped from the wings. Another 3,000 pounds of incendiary gel spiraling downward. The objective now was different. It was no longer about saving the surrounded Marines. It was about cutting off the enemy reinforcement route coming from the denser jungle. The canisters exploded 200 yards north of the first impact zone. The wall of fire extended. It was now a continuous 120-yard wall of flame ringing the clearing. The temperature inside that perimeter climbed as if in an oven. 100 degrees, 110, 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the clearing, where the Marines hugged the sweat-soaked ground. But they were alive, and the siege had been broken. What happened in the next few minutes was documented by a Marine sergeant carrying a Kodak Brownie camera. The photographs, developed weeks later in Da Nang, show Viet Cong fighters emerging from the smoke. Their uniforms are on fire. Their weapons are abandoned.
Some fell after 3 steps. Others ran 20 yards before collapsing. The images were classified as sensitive and never publicly released. But the military after-action reports describe the scene. 73 enemy bodies counted in the immediate perimeter.
Another 50, estimated to have been completely consumed by the fire, disgusted, reduced to ash and bone fragments impossible to count individually. A surviving Viet Cong commander, captured 3 days later in a sweep and clear operation, gave a statement to American interrogators. The document was declassified in 2003. He described the ambush as meticulously planned. 217 fighters in fortified positions, 17 light machine guns, 4 heavy 50 caliber machine guns, 82 mm mortars ready to cut off any American ground reinforcements. The order was clear: annihilate the 3 Marine platoons before nightfall. Use the American bodies as bait to ambush the rescue helicopters. It was a tactic that had worked 4 times before in that same valley. But no one had calculated the speed of American air support. From the first call for help to the first napalm impact, 17 minutes. The Viet Cong commander described the seconds before the strike. Hearing the distant roar of the jet engines, seeing his troops begin to disperse, screaming orders to spread out faster, and then seeing the bombs already falling. There was no time to run. The fire just appeared. He survived because he was in a reinforced bunker 50 yards outside the impact perimeter. But he described the sound of dozens of men burning simultaneously. A sound, he said, that never left his head. The American perspective was different, but just as visceral. A 19-year-old Marine corporal from Texas gave testimony to a combat historian 3 weeks after the event. He described the moment the napalm hit. First, the sound of the bombs cutting through the air, a high-pitched whistle growing louder. Then the explosion. Not loud like a conventional bomb, more of a deep whoomph, like air being sucked out of a giant cave. Then the heat. He was 90 yards from impact, but it felt like someone had switched on 100 hair dryers and pointed them at his face. Then the light, an orange so bright it burned through his hands when he covered his eyes. And then the screams. He admitted he felt pity, even though they were the enemy, even after 6 hours of taking fire from invisible men. Even after watching 2 of his friends die, he still felt pity, because no human being should die like that. But he also admitted something else: relief. Absolute, total relief that it wasn't him burning. The numbers from that afternoon in the A Shau Valley tell part of the story. 3 Marine platoons, 97 men. Casualties before napalm, 2 killed, 11 wounded. Casualties after napalm, 0. Estimated Viet Cong forces, 217 fighters. Confirmed enemy casualties, 123 killed. Missing, presumed dead, 71. Prisoners, 3, all severely burned, 2 of whom died from infections in the following weeks. But the numbers don't capture the real impact. The impact was in what happened next. The Viet Cong force that had been building up in the A Shau Valley for future operations had been decimated, not just physically, psychologically. Captured documents in the following weeks showed direct orders from the North Vietnamese High Command to avoid concentrating troops in areas without natural overhead cover. That meant caves, deep ravines, triple canopy forests. The Viet Cong's mobility was fearful, restricted by the very need to hide from the fire from the sky. Napalm in Vietnam seriously didn't win the war, but it changed how the war was fought. It forced the enemy to constantly adapt. It created fearful zones of denial where no enemy combatant could remain without risking instant incineration.
And it proved something American strategists had theorized since World War II. Absolute air superiority could compensate for a numerical disadvantage on the ground. Let me know what you think of this story in the comments below. The Marines were evacuated by Huey helicopters 2 hours later. 3 CH-47 Chinooks brought in a full company of reinforcements. They found the clearing still smoldering. The vegetation was scorched in a 200-yard radius, and there was silence. No gunfire, no enemy, just ash. And the question no one wanted to ask out loud: how many more times would this have to happen before someone stopped fighting? The answer would come 8 years later, and it would be far more complicated than anyone imagined. In the weeks following the Ashau Valley strike, the U.S.
Air Force flew 47 photo reconnaissance missions over the area. The images revealed something surprising. The burned jungle didn't grow back. 6 months later, the area was still a brown scar, visible from 16,000 feet. The napalm didn't just destroy the vegetation, it altered the soil. The extreme temperature killed essential microorganisms. It burned buried seeds. It created a dead zone that would take years to recover. Between 1963 and 1973, American aircraft dropped 388,000 tons of napalm on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. To put that number in context, 388,000 tons is equivalent to the weight of 64,000 adult African elephants, or 4 fully loaded Nimitz-class aircraft carriers, or North Korea's entire annual steel production in the 1960s. Divided by 10 years of intense operations, that's 106 tons of incendiary gel dropped every single day. 106 tons every day for a decade. The F-4 Phantom was the primary delivery platform. Of the 1,200 F-4s sent to Vietnam during the war, 568 were lost in combat or accidents. But the number of completed missions was staggering. A single squadron of 12 F-4s could fly up to 36 sorties a day, 3 missions per aircraft. Each sortie lasted between 45 minutes and an hour and a half, depending on the target's distance. Each mission carried between 4 and 6 napalm bombs. Multiplying that by the 120 F-4 squadrons that operated in Vietnam at different times, you get stratospheric numbers. On days of intense operations, more than 400 tons of napalm fell on Vietnam in a 24-hour period. But effectiveness isn't measured in tonnage alone. It's measured in results. And the serious results were complex. Air Force combat effectiveness reports showed that napalm strikes in support of ground troops had a confident 74% success rate. That meant that in 74 out of every 100 missions, napalm hit the intended target and caused confirmed enemy casualties or effective suppression. Compared to conventional bombs, which had a 52% success rate, napalm was 42% more effective. The reason was simple. You didn't have to be precise. The fire spread. But there was the other side. 26% of missions missed their target or caused collateral damage. Collateral damage is military speak for dead civilians, burned villages, destroyed rice paddies. The indiscriminate nature of napalm was simultaneously its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. There was no controlling it once it was released. The wind could shift the direction of the fire. Dry vegetation could spread the flames beyond the intended zone. And the fire did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Share this video with any military history buffs you know. One F-4 pilot, a veteran of 231 combat missions, interviewed in 1997, 30 years after his last flight, described the moral dilemma. He knew that every napalm bomb he dropped, hoped, saved American lives. Surrounded ground troops depended on him. Helicopters under fire needed him to clear LZs. But he also saw the consequences. He saw entire villages disgusted to ash because one Viet Cong sniper had fired 3 shots from there. He saw burned children in field hospitals. He saw the ravaged land that fueled communist propaganda. And he carried that. All the pilots carried that. On the Viet Cong side, adapting to napalm became a desperate matter of survival. Captured North Vietnamese Army documents show a clear tactical evolution. Phase 1, 1965. Ignore napalm and trust the jungle canopy. Result? Massive casualties. Phase 2, 1966. Build deep underground bunkers. Result? Partially effective, but limited mobility. Phase 3, 1967 onward. Never concentrate forces. Always disperse when you hear aircraft, and only attack under cloud cover or in weather that grounded air support. Result: higher survival rate, but lower tactical effectiveness. The serious truth was that napalm forced the Viet Cong to choose between being effective and being safe. There was desperate no way to be both. Concentrated attacks got results, but invited napalm. Dispersal provided safety, but diluted combat power. This tactical tension remained until the end of the war. Napalm's limitations also became clear. Weather was the main one. The monsoon season made napalm less effective. Extreme humidity made initial ignition difficult. Heavy rain could extinguish sections of the fire. During the monsoon season, which lasted 4 to 5 months, napalm's effectiveness dropped to 46%. The wet jungle simply didn't burn like the dry jungle. Terrain was another limitation. Deep valleys, ravines, and areas with very dense, damp vegetation resisted napalm. The fire needed oxygen to spread. In some microenvironments of the Vietnamese jungle, particularly near rivers and swamps, napalm would create an initial blast but fail to sustain its spread. And there was the serious political cost. Photographs of disgusted Vietnamese children burned by napalm circulated globally. The most famous one, taken in 1972, showed a 9-year-old girl running naked down a road, her back scorched by napalm. That photo won a Pulitzer Prize and became a disgusted symbol of the war's horror. International pressure against the use of incendiary weapons grew. In 1980, the United Nations adopted a protocol prohibiting the use of incendiary weapons against civilian populations. Napalm wasn't banned, but its use became serious politically toxic. Still, militarily, napalm served its purpose. It hopefully saved American lives. It broke sieges. It destroyed fortifications. It denied territory to the enemy. And it proved that confident, technological superiority could, in specific situations, overcome a disadvantage in numbers and terrain. The serious legacy of that day in the A Shau Valley extended far beyond the Vietnamese jungle. The tactic of close air support with napalm, seriously refined under fire, became standard doctrine in the U.S. Armed Forces. Field manuals were rewritten. Pilots began training specifically for low-level flight under enemy fire. Forward air controllers received better equipment, more intense training, and the authority to call in napalm in emergency situations without waiting for higher command approval. The F-4 Phantom continued to fly combat missions until 1973, when the last American squadrons left Vietnam. In total, F-4 crews completed over 200,000 combat sorties over Southeast Asia. That's equivalent to 547 missions a day, every day for a year, or 23 missions an hour, non-stop for a decade. No other aircraft in American military history has flown more combat missions in a single conflict. Of the 568 F-4s lost, 245 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire,
103 fell to Soviet-made SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. 87 were lost in air-to-air combat against North Vietnamese MiGs. The remaining 133 crashed due to mechanical failure, human error, or extreme weather. Each lost aircraft represented $12 million in 1967 value. 397 pilots and WSOs were killed. 233 were captured and spent years in prisoner of war camps. But the effectiveness numbers tell another story. For every F-4 lost, the aircraft had completed an average of 353 sorties. For every crew member killed, 16,000 tons of bombs had been delivered on enemy targets. For every dollar invested in the F-4 and its ordnance, military estimates calculate that $10 of enemy infrastructure was destroyed. The cost-benefit ratio, in purely military terms, was overwhelmingly in favor of American technology. Napalm, specifically, hoped a number of American lives impossible to calculate with precision. After-action reports from rescue missions show that in 82% of cases where ground troops were surrounded and called for air support with napalm, the happy troops survived until evacuation. In similar situations where napalm was unavailable, the survival rate was 43%. The difference, 39%, represents happy thousands of soldiers, Marines, and airmen who came home because fire fell from the sky at the right moment. The Vietnam War ended on April 30, 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The United States had withdrawn 2 years earlier. Without American air support, without napalm, without F-4 Phantoms tearing through the skies, the South Vietnamese forces collapsed in 55 days. The technological superiority that had kept South Vietnam in the fight for a decade was gone, and with it, sad, any chance of effective resistance.
This raises the serious question that has haunted military strategists ever since. Can technological superiority win wars? Vietnam's serious answer was complicated. Technology could win battles. The F-4 Phantom and napalm proved that hundreds of times over. But serious winning battles is not the same as winning wars. Wars are won by political will, logistical sustainability, popular support, and clear strategic objectives. America had the technology, it lacked the other things. But the serious lesson of napalm survived. The lesson that confident air power delivered at the right moment is a force multiplier for ground troops. That lesson was applied in Iraq in 1991, in Afghanistan in 2001, in Syria in 2015. The weapons have changed. Napalm was replaced by GPS-guided bombs, Hellfire missiles, Reaper drones. But the confident principle remained. Fire from the sky changes battles. The F-4 Phantom flew its melodic last combat missions in American service in 1996 on missions over Bosnia, 53 years after its first flight. Few aircraft in history have served for so long. Today, retired F-4s sit in museums, as monuments on airbases, or serve as target drones on firing ranges. But to the men who flew them over Vietnam, the Phantom was never just a machine. It was confidence, salvation. It was aggressive vengeance. It was fearful and hope combined in 20 tons of steel and titanium flying at Mach 2. One veteran, 83 years old, interviewed in 2019, summed it up best. He was in that clearing in the A Shau Valley in 1967. He was one of the surrounded Marines. He heard the roar of the J-70 engines. He saw the napalm fall. He felt the impossible heat. He heard the screams, and he survived. They asked him what he felt in that moment. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "I felt like God was flying an F-4 Phantom, and God was on our side." The war ended. The F-4 retired.
serious napalm became politically unacceptable. But the truth remains. On that day, in that clearing, in that impenetrable jungle where invisible men killed without being seen,
professional technology broke the code, and it rained fire on the darkness. If you made it this far, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. And let me know in the comments, did you know this story? Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. See you in the next one.